Section 8. Revolution effected in manufacture, handicrafts, and domestic industry by modern industry. A. Overthrow of cooperation based on handicraft and on the division of labor. We have seen how machinery does away with cooperation based on handicrafts and with manufacture based on the division of handicraft labor. An example of the first sort is the mowing machine. It replaces cooperation between mowers. A striking example of the second kind is the needle-making machine. According to Adam Smith, 10 men in his day made in cooperation over 48,000 needles a day. On the other hand, a single needle-making machine makes 145,000 in a working day of 11 hours. One woman or one girl superintends 4 such machines, and so produces near upon 600,000 needles in a day, and upwards of 3 million in a week. A single machine, when it takes the place of cooperation or of manufacture, may itself serve as the basis of an industry of a handicraft character. Still, such a return to handicrafts is but a transition to the factory system, which, as a rule, makes its appearance so soon as the human muscles were replaced, for the purpose of driving the machines, by a mechanical motive power, such as steam or water. Here and there, but in any case only for a time, an industry may be carried on a small scale, by means of mechanical power. This is effected by hiring steam power, as is done in some of the Birmingham trades, or by the use of small caloric engines, as in some branches of weaving. Footnote, in the United States, the restoration in this way of handicrafts based on machinery is frequent, and therefore when the inevitable transition to the factory system shall take place, the ensuing concentration will, compared with Europe and even with England, stride on in 7-league boots. Back to the main text. In the Coventry silk weaving industry, the experiment of cottage factories was tried. In the center of a square surrounded by rows of cottages, an engine house was built, and the engine connected by shafts with the looms in the cottages. In all cases, the power was hired at so much per loom. The rent was payable weekly, whether the looms worked or not. Each cottage held from 2 to 6 looms. Some belonged to the weaver, some were bought on credit, some were hired. The struggle between these cottage factories and the factory proper lasted over 12 years. It ended with the complete ruin of the 300 cottage factories. Wherever the nature of the process did not involve production on a large scale, the new industries that have sprung up in the last few decades, such as envelope making, steel pen making, etc., have, as a general rule, first passed through the handicraft stage, then through the manufacturing stage, as short phases of transition to the factory stage. The transition is very difficult in those cases where the production of the article by manufacture consists not of a series of graduated processes, but of a great number of disconnected ones. This circumstance formed a great hindrance to the establishment of steel pen factories. Nevertheless, about 15 years ago, a machine was invented that automatically performed 6 separate operations at once. The first steel pens were supplied by the handicraft system in the year 1820 at £7 4 shillings the gross. In 1830, they were supplied by manufacture at 8 shillings, and today the factory system supplies them to the trade at from 2 to 6 pence the gross. Footnote, Mr. Gillott erected in Birmingham the first steel pen factory on a large scale. It produced so early as 1851 over 180 million pens yearly, and consumed 120 tons of steel. Birmingham has the monopoly of this industry in the United Kingdom and at present produces thousands of millions of steel pens. According to the census of 1861, the number of persons employed was 1,428, of whom 1,268 were females from 5 years of age upwards. B. Reaction of the factory system on manufacture and domestic industries. Along with the development of the factory system and of the revolution in agriculture that accompanies it, production in all the other branches of industry not only extends, but alters its character. The principle carried out in the factory system of analyzing the process of production into its constituent phases, and of solving the problems thus proposed by the application of mechanics, of chemistry, and the whole range of the natural sciences, becomes the determining principle everywhere. Hence, machinery squeezes itself into the manufacturing industries first for one detail process, then for another. Thus, the solid crystal of their organization, based on the old division of labor, becomes dissolved, and makes way for constant changes. Independently of this, a radical change takes place in the composition of the collective laborer, a change of the persons working in combination. In contrast with the manufacturing period, the division of labor is thenceforth based, wherever possible, on the employment of women, of children of all ages, and of unskilled laborers, in one word, on cheap labor, as it is characteristically called in England. This is the case not only with all production on a large scale, whether employing machinery or not, but also with the so-called domestic industry, whether carried on in the houses of the workers or in small workshops. This modern so-called domestic industry has nothing, except the name, in common with the old-fashioned domestic industry, the existence of which presupposes independent urban handicrafts, independent peasant farming, and above all, a dwelling house for the laborer and his family. That old-fashioned industry has now been converted into an outside department of the factory, the manufactory, or the warehouse. Besides the factory operatives, the manufacturing workers, and the handicraftsmen, whom it concentrates in large masses at one spot and directly commands, Kapital also sets in motion, by means of invisible threads, another army, that of the workers in the domestic industries, who dwell in the large towns and are also scattered over the face of the country. An example: the shirt factory of Monsieur Tilly at Londonderry, which employs 1,000 operatives in the factory itself, and 9,000 people spread up and down the country and working in their own houses. The exploitation of cheap and immature labor power is carried out in a more shameless manner in modern manufacture than in the factory proper. This is because the technical foundation of the factory system, namely the substitution of machines for muscular power, and the light character of the labor, is almost entirely absent in manufacture, and at the same time women and over-young children are subjected, in a most unconscionable way, to the influence of poisonous or injurious substances. This exploitation is more shameless in the so-called domestic industry than in manufactures, and that because the power of resistance in the laborers decreases with their dissemination, because a whole series of plundering parasites insinuate themselves between the employer and the worker, because a domestic industry has always to compete either with the factory system or with manufacturing in the same branch of production, because poverty robs the worker of the conditions most essential to their labor, of space, light, and ventilation, because employment becomes more and more irregular, and finally because in these, the last resorts of the masses made redundant by modern industry and agriculture, competition for work attains its maximum. Economy in the means of production, first systematically carried out in the factory system, and there, from the very beginning, coincident with the most reckless squandering of labor power and robbery of the conditions normally requisite for labor, this economy now shows its antagonistic and murderous side more and more in a given branch of industry, the less the social productive power of labor and the technical basis for a combination of processes are developed in that branch. C. Modern manufacture. I now proceed by a few examples to illustrate the principles laid down above. As a matter of fact, the reader is already familiar with numerous instances given in the chapter on the working day. In the hardware manufactures of Birmingham and the neighborhood, there are employed, mostly in very heavy work, 30,000 children and young persons besides 10,000 women. There they are to be seen in the unwholesome brass foundries, button factories, enameling, galvanizing, and lacquering works. Footnote, and now forsooth children are employed at file cutting in Sheffield. Back to the main text. Owing to the excessive labor of their workpeople, both adult and non-adult, certain London houses where newspapers and books are printed have got the ill-omened name of slaughterhouses, according to the Children's Employment Commission Report 1866. Similar excesses are practiced in bookbinding, where the victims are chiefly women, girls, and children. Young persons have to do heavy work in rope walks and night work in salt mines, candle manufactories, and chemical works. Young people are worked to death at turning the looms and silk weaving, when it is not carried on by machinery. Footnote, the commissioner justly remarks that, though as a rule machines take the place of men, here literally young persons replace machines. Back to the main text. One of the most shameful, the most dirty, and the worst paid kinds of labor, and one on which women and young girls are by preference employed, is the sorting of rags. It is well known that Great Britain, apart from its own immense store of rags, is the emporium for the rag trade of the whole world. They flow in from Japan, from the most remote states of South America, and from the Canary Islands. But the chief sources of their supply are Germany, France, Russia, Italy, Egypt, Turkey, Belgium, and Holland. They're used for manure, for making bed flocks, for shoddy, and they serve as the raw material of paper. The rag sorters are the medium for the spread of smallpox and other infectious diseases, and they themselves are the first victims. Footnote, see the report on the rag trade and numerous details in Public Health, 8th Report, London, 1866. Back to the main text. A classical example of overwork, of hard and inappropriate labor, and of its brutalizing effects on the worker from their childhood upwards, is afforded not only by coal mining and miners generally, but also by tile and brick making, in which industry the recently invented machinery is, in England, used only here and there. Between May and September, the work lasts from 5 in the morning till 8 in the evening, and where the drying is done in the open air, it often lasts from 4 in the morning till 9 in the evening. Work from 5 in the morning until 7 in the evening is considered, quote, reduced and, quote, moderate. Both boys and girls of 6 and even of 4 years of age are employed. They work for the same number of hours, often longer than the adults. The work is hard, and the summer heat increases the exhaustion. In a certain tile field at Moseley, e.g., a young woman 24 years of age was in the habit of making 2,000 tiles a day, with the assistance of 2 little girls, who carried the clay for her and stacked the tiles. These girls carried daily 10 tons up the slippery sides of the clay pits, from a depth of 30 feet, and then for a distance of 210 feet. Quote, "It is impossible for a child to pass through the purgatory of a tile field without great moral degradation. The low language which they are accustomed to hear from their tenderest years, the filthy, indecent, and shameless habits amidst which, unknowing and half wild, they grow up, make them in after life lawless, abandoned, dissolute. A frightful source of demoralization is the mode of living. Each molder, who is always a skilled laborer and the chief of a group, supplies his 7 subordinates with board and lodging in his cottage. Whether members of his family or not, the men, boys, and girls all sleep in the cottage, which contains generally 2, exceptionally 3 rooms, all on the ground floor and badly ventilated. These people are so exhausted after the day's hard work that neither the rules of health, of cleanliness, nor of decency are in the least observed. Many of these cottages are models of untidiness, dirt, and dust. The greatest evil of the system that employs young girls on this sort of work consists in this, that, as a rule, it chains them fast from childhood for the whole of their after life to the most abandoned rabble. They become rough, foul-mouthed boys before nature has taught them that they are women. Clothed in a few dirty rags, the legs naked far above the knees, hair and face besmeared with dirt, they learn to treat all feelings of decency and of shame with contempt. During meal times, they lie at full length in the fields, or watch the boys bathing in a neighboring canal. Their heavy day's work at length completed, they put on better clothes and accompany the men to the public houses, unquote. Public houses being pubs. That excessive insobriety is prevalent from childhood upwards among the whole of this class is only natural. Quote, "The worst is that the brickmakers despair of themselves. You might as well, said one of the better kind to a chaplain of Southalfield, try to raise and improve the devil as a brickie, sir." That's quoting from the Children's Employment Commission Report, 1866. As to the manner in which capital affects an economy in the requisites of labor, in modern manufacture, in which I include all workshops of larger size, except factories proper, official and most ample material bearing on it is to be found in the Public Health Reports No. 4, 1863, and 6, 1864. The description of the workshops, more especially those of the London printers and tailors, surpasses the most loathsome fantasies of our romance writers. The effect on the health of the workers is self-evident. Dr. Simon, the chief medical officer of the Privy Council and the official editor of the Public Health Report, says, quote, "In my 4th report, 1863, I showed how it is practically impossible for the workpeople to insist upon that which is their first sanitary right, viz., the right that no matter what the work for which their employer brings them together, the labor, so far as it depends upon him, should be freed from all avoidably unwholesome conditions. I pointed out that while the work people are practically incapable of doing themselves this sanitary justice, they are unable to obtain any effective support from the paid administrations of the sanitary police. The life of myriads of workmen and workwomen is now uselessly tortured and shortened by the never-ending physical suffering that their mere occupation begets." That's quoting the Public Health 6 Report, London, 1864. In illustration of the way in which the workrooms influence the state of health, Dr. Simon gives the following table of mortality. And so there's a table comparing agriculture in England and Wales against London tailors and separately London printers. And it shows 3 different age columns, 25 to 35, 35 to 45, and 45 to 55, showing the death rate per 100,000 men in the respective industries between the stated ages, and basically for the tailors and printers it is significantly more than in agriculture, and in the upper age brackets it's double, or as much as double. And there's a footnote. Dr. Simon remarks that the mortality among the London tailors and printers between the ages of 25 and 35 is in fact much greater because the employers in London obtain from the country a great number of young people up to 30 years of age as, quote, apprentices and improvers who come for the purpose of being perfected in their trade. These figure in the census as Londoners. They swell out the number of heads on which the London death rate is calculated, but without adding proportionally to the number of deaths in that place. The greater part of them, in fact, return to the country, and especially in cases of severe illness. Back to the main text. D. Modern domestic industry. I now come to the so-called domestic industry. In order to get an idea of the horrors of the sphere in which capital conducts its exploitation in the background of modern mechanical industry, one must go to the apparently quite idyllic trade of nail-making, carried on in a few remote villages of England. And footnote, I allude here to hammered nails, as distinguished from nails cut out and made by machinery. See the Children's Employment Commission third report. Back to the main text. In this place, however, it will be enough to give a few examples from those branches of the lace-making and straw-plaiting industries that are not yet carried on by the aid of machinery, and that as yet do not compete with branches carried on in factories or in manufactories. Of the 150,000 persons employed in England in the production of lace, about 10,000 fall under the authority of the Factory Act, 1861. Almost the whole of the remaining 140,000 are women, young persons, and children of both sexes, the male sex, however, being weakly represented. The state of health of this cheap material for exploitation will be seen from the following table, computed by Dr. Truman, physician to the Nottingham General Dispensary. Out of 686 female patients who were lace makers, most of them between the ages of 17 and 24, the number of consumptive ones, consumption meaning a wasting disease, particularly tuberculosis, were in 1852, 1 in 45. In 1853, 1 in 28. The next year, 1 in 17. 1856, 1 in 15. 1857, 1 in 13. 1858, 1 in 15. 1859, 1 in 9. 1861, 1 in 8. That's according to the Children's Employment Commission report. So, steadily increasing prevalence over a decade's time. This progress in the rate of consumption ought to suffice for the most optimistic of progressists and for the biggest hawker of lies among the free trade bagmen of Germany. The Factory Act of 1861 regulates the actual making of the lace so far as it is done by machinery, and this is the rule in England. The branches that we are now about to examine, solely with regard to those of the workpeople who work at home, and not those who work in manufactories or warehouses, fall into two divisions, viz. 1. Finishing, or 2. Mending. The former gives the finishing touches to the machine-made lace, and includes numerous subdivisions. The lace finishing is done either in what are called mistresses' houses, or by women in their own houses, with or without the help of their children. The women who keep the mistresses' houses are themselves poor. The workroom is in a private house. The mistresses take orders from manufacturers or from warehousemen and employ as many women, girls, and young children as the size of their rooms and the fluctuating demand of the business will allow. The number of the workwomen employed in these workrooms varies from 20 to 40 in some and from 10 to 20 in others. The average age at which the children commence work is 6 years, but in many cases it is below 5. The usual working hours are from 8 in the morning until 8 in the evening, with 1.5 hours for meals, which are taken at irregular intervals and often in the foul workrooms. When business is brisk, the labor frequently lasts from 8 or even 6 o'clock in the morning until 10, 11, or 12 o'clock at night. In English barracks, the regulation space allotted to each soldier is 500 to 600 cubic feet, and in the military hospitals 1,200 cubic feet. But in those finishing sties there are but 67 to 100 cubic feet to each person. At the same time, the oxygen of the air is consumed by gas lights. In order to keep the lace clean, and although the floor is tiled or gagged, the children are often compelled, even in winter, to pull off their shoes. Quote, it is not at all uncommon in Nottingham to find 14 to 20 children huddled together in a small room of perhaps not more than 12 feet square, and employed for 15 hours out of the 24, at work that of itself is exhausting from its weariness and monotony, and is besides carried on under every possible unwholesome condition. Even the very youngest children work at a strained attention and a rapidity that is astonishing, hardly ever giving their fingers rest or glowering their motion. If a question be asked them, they never raise their eyes from their work, from fear of losing a single moment." Unquote. The so-called long stick is used by the mistresses as a stimulant more and more as the working hours are prolonged. Quote, the children gradually tire and become as restless as birds toward the end of their long detention at an occupation that is monotonous, eye-straining, and exhausting from the uniformity in the posture of the body. Their work is like slavery. That's from the Children's Employment Commission 2, 1864. When women and their children work at home, which nowadays means in a hired room, often in a garret, the state of things is, if possible, still worse. This sort of work is given out within a circle of 80 miles radius from Nottingham. On leaving the warehouses at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, the children are often given a bundle of lace to take home with them and finish. The Pharisee of a capitalist, represented by one of his servants, accompanies this action, of course, with the unctuous phrase, "That's for mother," yet he knows well enough that the poor children must sit up and help. Pillow lace making is chiefly carried on in England in two agricultural districts. One, the Honiton Lace District, extending from 20 to 30 miles along the south coast of Devonshire, and including a few places in North Devon, the other comprising a great part of the counties of Buckingham, Bedford, and Northampton, and also the adjoining portions of Oxfordshire and Huntingdonshire. The cottages of the agricultural laborers are the places where the work is usually carried on. Many manufacturers employ upwards of 3,000 of these lace makers, who are chiefly children and young persons of the female sex exclusively. The state of things described as incidental to lace finishing are here repeated, save that instead of the mistresses' houses, we find what are called lace schools, kept by poor women in their cottages. From their 5th year and often earlier until their 12th or 15th year, the children work in these schools. During the first year, the very young ones work from 4 to 8 hours, and later on from 6 in the morning till 8 and 10 o'clock at night. Quoting the Children's Employment Commission report, the rooms are generally the ordinary living rooms of small cottages, the chimney stopped up to keep out drafts, the inmates kept warm by their own animal heat alone, and this frequently in winter. In other cases, these so-called schoolrooms are like small storerooms without fireplaces. The overcrowding in these dens and the consequent vitiation of the air are often extreme. Added to this is the injurious effect of drains, privies, decomposing substances, and other filth usual in the purlieus of the smaller cottages. With regard to space, in one lace school, 18 girls and a mistress, 35 cubic feet to each person. In another, where the smell was unbearable, 18 persons and 24.5 cubic feet per head. In this industry are to be found employed children of 2 and 2.5 years. Unquote. Where lace-making ends in the counties of Buckingham and Bedford, straw plaiting begins, and extends over a large part of Hertfordshire and the westerly and northerly parts of Essex. In 1861, there were 40,043 persons employed in straw plaiting and straw hat making. Of these, 3,815 were males of all ages, the rest females, of whom 14,913, including about 7,000 children, were under 20 years of age. In the place of the lace schools, we find here these straw plait schools. The children commence their instruction in straw plaiting generally in their 4th, often between their 3rd and 4th year. Education, of course, they get none. The children themselves call the elementary schools natural schools, to distinguish them from these blood-sucking institutions, in which they are kept at work simply to get through the task, generally 30 yards daily, prescribed by their half-starved mothers. These same mothers often make them work at home after school is over till 10, 11, and 12 o'clock at night. The straw cuts their mouths, with which they constantly moisten it, and their fingers. Dr. Ballard gives it as the general opinion of the whole body of medical officers in London that 300 cubic feet is the minimum space proper for each person in a bedroom or workroom. And commenting for context, that's about 5.5 by 5.5 by 10. Continuing, but in the straw plait schools, space is more sparingly allotted than in the lace schools. Quote, 12 2/3, 17, 18.5, and below 22 cubic feet for each person. Unquote. Quote, the smaller of these numbers, says one of the commissioners, Mr. White, represents less space than the half of what a child would occupy if packed in a box measuring 3 feet in each direction. Unquote. Thus do the children enjoy life until the age of 12 or 14. The wretched, half-starved parents think of nothing but getting as much as possible out of their children. The latter, as soon as they're grown up, do not care a farthing, and naturally so, for their parents, and leave them. Quote, it is no wonder that ignorance and vice abound in a population so brought up. Their morality is at the lowest ebb. A great number of the women have illegitimate children, and that at such an immature age that even those most conversant with criminal statistics are astounded," unquote. And commenting, most of these quotes are from the Children's Employment Commission 1864, some from other years like 1863. Continuing, "And the native land of these model families is the pattern Christian country for Europe," so says at least Count Montalembert, certainly a competent authority on Christianity. Wages in the above industries, miserable as they are, the maximum wages of a child in the straw plate schools rising in rare cases to 3 shillings, are reduced far below their nominal amount by the prevalence of the truck system everywhere, but especially in the lace districts. E. Passage of modern manufacture and domestic industry into modern mechanical industry, the hastening of this revolution by the application of the Factory Acts to those industries. The cheapening of labor power by sheer abuse of the labor of women and children, by sheer robbery of every normal condition requisite for working and living, and by the sheer brutality of overwork and night work, meets at last with natural obstacles that cannot be overstepped. So also, when based on these methods, do the cheapening of commodities and capitalist exploitation in general. So soon as this point is at last reached, and it takes many years, the hour has struck for the introduction of machinery, and for the thenceforth rapid conversion of the scattered domestic industries and also of manufactures into factory industries. An example on the most colossal scale of this movement is afforded by the production of wearing apparel. This industry, according to the classification of the Children's Employment Commission, comprises straw hat makers, ladies' hat makers, cap makers, tailors, milliners and dressmakers, shirt makers, corset makers, glove makers, shoe makers, besides many minor branches such as the making of neckties, collars, etc. In 1861, the number of females employed in these industries, in England and Wales, amounted to 586,299. Of these, 115,242 at the least were under 20, and 16,650 under 15 years of age. The number of these workwomen in the United Kingdom in 1861 was 750,334. The number of males employed in England and Wales in hat-making, shoemaking, glove-making, and tailoring was 437,969. Of these, 14,964 under 15 years, 89,285 between 15 and 20, and 333,117 over 20 years. Many of the smaller branches are not included in these figures, but take the figures as they stand. We then have for England and Wales alone, according to the census of 1861, a total of 1,024,277 persons, about as many as are absorbed by agriculture and cattle breeding. We begin to understand what becomes of the immense quantities of goods conjured up by the magic of machinery, and of the enormous masses of workpeople which that machinery sets free. The production of wearing apparel is carried on partly in manufactories in whose workrooms there is but a reproduction of that division of labor, the membra disjecta of which were found ready to hand, partly by small master handicraftsmen. These, however, do not, as formerly, work for individual consumers, but for manufactories and warehouses, and to such an extent that often whole towns and stretches of country carry on certain branches, such as shoemaking, as a specialty. Finally, on a very great scale by the so-called domestic workers, who form an external department of the manufactories, warehouses, and even of the workshops of the smaller masters. Footnote, in England, millinery and dressmaking are for the most part carried on the premises of the employer, partly by workwomen who live there, and partly by women who live off of the premises. Back to the main text. The raw material, etc. is supplied by mechanical industry. The mass of cheap human material, endlessly exploitable, is composed of the individuals, quote, liberated by mechanical industry and improved agriculture. The manufactures of this class owed their origin chiefly to the capitalist's need of having at hand an army ready equipped to meet any increase of demand. Footnote, Mr. White, a commissioner, visited a military clothing manufactory that employed 1,000 to 1,200 persons, almost all females, and a shoe manufactory with 1,300 persons. Of these, nearly one-half were children and young persons. Back to the main text. The manufacturers, nevertheless, allowed the scattered handicrafts and domestic industries to continue to exist as a broad foundation. The great production of surplus value in these branches of labor, and the progressive cheapening of their articles, were and are chiefly due to the minimum wages paid, no more than requisite for a miserable vegetation, and to the extension of working time up to the maximum endurable by the human organism. It was in fact by the cheapness of the human sweat and the human blood, which were converted into commodities, that the markets were constantly being extended, and continue daily to be extended. More especially was this the case with England's colonial markets, where besides, English tastes and habits prevail. At last the critical point was reached. The basis of the old method, sheer brutality in the exploitation of the workpeople, accompanied more or less by a systematic division of labor, no longer sufficed for the extending markets and for the still more rapidly extending competition of the capitalists. The hour struck for the advent of machinery. The decisively revolutionary machine, the machine which attacks in an equal degree the whole of the numberless branches of the sphere of production, dressmaking, tailoring, shoemaking, sewing, hat-making, and many others, is the sewing machine. Its immediate effect on the workpeople is like that of all machinery, which since the rise of modern industry has seized upon new branches of trade. Children of too tender an age are sent adrift. The wage of the machine hands rises compared with that of the house workers, many of whom belong to the poorest of the poor. That of the better situated handicraftsmen, with whom the machine competes, sinks. The new machine hands are exclusively girls and young women. With the help of mechanical force, they destroy the monopoly that male labor had of the heavier work, and they drive off from the lighter work numbers of old women and very young children. The overpowering competition crushes the weakest of the manual laborers. The fearful increase in death from starvation during the last 10 years in London runs parallel with the extension of machine sewing. Footnote, an instance. The weekly report of deaths by the Registrar General, dated 26 February 1864, contains 5 cases of death from starvation. On the same day, the Times reports another case, 6 victims of starvation in 1 week. Back to the main text. The new workwomen turn the machines by hand and foot, or by hand alone, sometimes sitting, sometimes standing, according to the weight, size, and special make of the machine, and expend a great deal of labor power. Their occupation is unwholesome, owing to the long hours, although in most cases they are not so long as under the old system. Wherever the sewing machine locates itself in narrow and already overcrowded workrooms, it adds to the unwholesome influences. Quote, the effect, says Mr. Lord, on entering low-ceilinged workrooms in which 30 to 40 machine hands are working is unbearable. The heat, partly due to the gas stoves used for warming the irons, is horrible. Even when moderate hours of work, i.e. from 8 in the morning till 6 in the evening, prevail in such places, yet 3 or 4 persons fall into a swoon regularly every day. That's quoting from the Children's Employment Commission Second Report, 1864. Back to the main text. The revolution in the industrial methods, which is the necessary result of the revolution in the instruments of production, is effected by a medley of transition forms. These forms vary according to the extent to which the sewing machine has become prevalent in one branch of industry or the other, to the time during which it has been in operation, to the previous condition of the workpeople, to the preponderance of manufacture, of handicrafts, or of domestic industry, to the rent of the workrooms, etc. Footnote, quote, the rental of premises required for workrooms seems the element which ultimately determines the point, and consequently it is in the metropolis that the old system of giving out work to small employers and families has been longest retained and earliest returned to. That's also from the Children's Employment Commission report. The concluding statement in this quotation refers exclusively to shoemaking. Back to the main text. In dressmaking, for instance, where the labor was for the most part already organized chiefly by simple cooperation, the sewing machine at first formed merely a new factor in that manufacturing industry. In tailoring, shirt-making, shoemaking, etc., all the forms are intermingled. Here the factory system proper. There middlemen receive the raw material from the capitalist-in-chief and group around their sewing machines in chambers and garrets, so-called, from 10 to 50 or more workwomen. Finally, as is always the case with machinery when not organized into a system, and when it can also be used in dwarfish proportions, handicraftsmen and domestic workers, along with their families, or with a little extra labor from without, make use of their own sewing machines. Footnote, in glove-making and other industries where the condition of the workpeople is hardly distinguishable from that of paupers, this does not occur. Back to the main text. The system actually prevalent in England is that the capitalist concentrates a large number of machines on his premises and then distributes the produce of those machines for further manipulation amongst the domestic workers. The variety of the transition forms, however, does not conceal the tendency to conversion into the factory system proper. This tendency is nurtured by the very nature of the sewing machine, the manifold uses of which push on the concentration, under one roof and one management, of previously separated branches of a trade. It is also favored by the circumstance that preparatory needlework, and certain other operations, are most conveniently done on the premises where the machine is at work, as well as by the inevitable expropriation of the hand sewers and of the domestic workers who work with their own machines. This fate has already in part overtaken them. The constantly increasing amount of capital invested in sewing machines gives the spur to the production of, and gluts the markets with, machine-made articles, thereby giving the signal to the domestic workers for the sale of their machines. Footnote, in the wholesale boot and shoe trade of Leicester alone, there were, in 1864, 800 sewing machines already in use. Back to the main text. The overproduction of sewing machines themselves causes their producers, in bad want of a sale, to let them out for so much a week, thus crushing by their deadly competition the small owners of machines. Constant changes in the construction of the machines, and their ever-increasing cheapness, depreciate day by day the older makes, and allow of their being sold in great numbers at absurd prices to large capitalists, who alone can thus employ them at a profit. Finally, the substitution of the steam engine for man gives in this, as in all similar revolutions, the finishing blow. At first, the use of steam power meets with mere technical difficulties, such as unsteadiness in the machines, difficulty in controlling their speed, rapid wear and tear of the lighter machines, etc., all of which are soon overcome by experience. Footnote. Instances: the Army Clothing Depot at Pimlico, London, the shirt factory of Tilley and Henderson at Londonderry, and the clothes factory of Messrs. Tate at Limerick, which employs about 1,200 hands. Back to the main text. If on the one hand the concentration of many machines in large manufactories leads to the use of steam power, on the other hand, the competition of steam with human muscles hastens on the concentration of workpeople and machines in large factories. Thus England is at present experiencing, not only in the colossal industry of making wearing apparel, but in most of the other trades mentioned above, the conversion of manufacture, of handicrafts, and of domestic work into the factory system, after each of those forms of production, totally changed and disorganized under the influence of modern industry, has long ago reproduced, and even overdone, all the horrors of the factory system, without participating in any of the elements of social progress it contains. Footnote. This is Tendency to the Factory System from the Children's Employment Report. Quote, the whole employment is at this time in a state of transition, and is undergoing the same change as that effected in the lace trade, weaving, etc. It is, quote, a complete revolution, unquote. At the date of the Child's Employment Commission of 1840, stocking making was still done by manual labor. Since 1846, various sorts of machines have been introduced, which are now driven by steam. The total number of persons of both sexes and of all ages from 3 years upwards employed in stocking making in England was in 1862 about 129,000. Of these, only 4,063 were, according to the parliamentary return of the 11th February 1862, working under the Factory Acts. Back to the main text. This industrial revolution, which takes place spontaneously, is artificially helped on by the extension of the Factory Acts to all industries in which women, young persons, and children are employed. The compulsory regulation of the working day as regards its length, pauses, beginning and end, the system of relays of children, the exclusion of all children under a certain age, etc., necessitate on the one hand more machinery, and the substitution of steam as a motive power in the place of muscles. Footnote. Thus, in the earthenware trade, Messrs. Cochrane of the Britain Pottery, Glasgow, report, quote, to keep up our quantity, we have gone extensively into machines wrought by unskilled labor, and every day convinces us that we can produce a greater quantity than by the old method, unquote. It's from the Report of Inspector of Factories, 31st October, 1865. Quote, the effect of the Factory Acts is to force on the further introduction of machinery, unquote. Thus, after the extension of the Factory Act to the potteries, great increase of power jiggers in place of hand-moved jiggers. Back to the main text. On the other hand, in order to make up for the loss of time, an expansion occurs of the means of production used in common, of the furnaces, buildings, etc. In one word, greater concentration of the means of production and a correspondingly greater concourse of workpeople. The chief objection, repeatedly and passionately urged on behalf of each manufacturer threatened with the Factory Act, is in fact this, that in order to continue the business on the old scale, a greater outlay of capital will be necessary. But as regards labor in the so-called domestic industries and the intermediate forms between them and manufacture, so soon as limits are put to the working day and to the employment of children, those industries go to the wall. Unlimited expansion of cheap labor power is the sole foundation of their power to compete. One of the essential conditions for the existence of the factory system, especially when the length of the working day is fixed, is certainty in the result. i.e. the production in a given time of a given quantity of commodities, or of a given useful effect. The statutory pauses in the working day, moreover, imply the assumption that periodical and sudden cessation of the work does no harm to the article undergoing the process of production. This certainty in the result, and this possibility of interrupting the work are, of course, easier to be attained in the purely mechanical industries than in those in which chemical and physical processes play a part, as for instance in the earthenware trade, in bleaching, dyeing, baking, and in most of the metal industries. Wherever there is a working day without restriction as to length, wherever there is night work and unrestricted waste of human life, there the slightest obstacle presented by the nature of the work to a change for the better is soon looked upon as an everlasting barrier erected by nature. No poison kills vermin with more certainty than the Factory Act removes such everlasting barriers. No one made a greater outcry over, quote, impossibilities than our friends the earthenware manufacturers. In 1864, however, they were brought under the Act, and within 16 months every, quote, impossibility had vanished. Quote, the improved method, called forth by the Act of making slip by pressure instead of by evaporation, the newly constructed stoves for drying the ware in its green state, etc., are each events of great importance in the pottery art, and mark an advance which the preceding century could not rival. It has even considerably reduced the temperature of the stoves themselves, with a considerable saving of fuel, and with a readier effect on the ware. That's quoting the report of Inspector of Factories, 31st October, 1865. In spite of every prophecy, the cost price of earthenware did not rise, but the quantity produced did, and to such an extent that the export for the 12 months ending December 1865 exceeded in value by 138,628 pounds the average of the preceding 3 years. In the manufacture of matches, it was thought to be an indispensable requirement that boys, even while bolting their dinner, should go on dipping the matches in melted phosphorus, the poisonous vapor from which rose into their faces. The Factory Act of 1864 made the saving of time a necessity, and so forced into existence a dipping machine, the vapor from which could not come into contact with the workers. Footnote, the introduction of this and other machinery into matchmaking caused in one department alone 230 young persons to be replaced by 32 boys and girls of 14 to 17 years of age. This saving in labor was carried still further in 1865 by the employment of steam power. Back to the main text. So at the present time, in those branches of the lace manufacture not yet subject to the Factory Act, it is maintained that the meal times cannot be regular, owing to the different periods required by the various kinds of lace for drying, which periods can vary from 3 minutes up to an hour and more. To this, the Children's Employment Commissioners answer, quote, the circumstances of this case are precisely analogous to that of the paper stainers dealt with in our first report. Some of the principal manufacturers in the trade urged that in consequence of the nature of the materials used and their various processes that they would be unable, without serious loss, to stop for meal times at any given moment. But it was seen from the evidence that by due care and previous arrangement, the apprehended difficulty would be got over, and accordingly, by Clause 6 of Section 6 of the Factory Acts Extension Act, passed during this session of Parliament, an interval of 18 months is given to them from the passing of the Act before they're required to conform to the meal hours specified by the Factory Acts. Unquote. Hardly had the act been passed when our friends the manufacturers found out, quote, the inconveniences we expected to arise from the introduction of the Factory Acts into our branch of manufacture, I am happy to say, have not arisen. We do not find the production at all interfered with. In short, we produce more in the same time. Unquote. It is evident that the English legislature, which certainly no one will venture to reproach with being overdosed with genius, has been led by experience to the conclusion that a simple compulsory law is sufficient to enact away all the so-called impediments opposed by the nature of the process to the restriction and regulation of the working day. Hence, on the introduction of the Factory Act into a given industry, a period varying from 6 to 18 months is fixed within which it is incumbent on the manufacturers to remove all technical impediments to the working of the Act. Mirabeau's "impossible, never say this terrible thing to me" is particularly applicable to modern technology. But though the Factory Acts thus artificially ripen the material elements necessary for the conversion of the manufacturing system into the factory system, yet at the same time, owing to the necessity they impose for greater outlay of capital, they hasten on the decline of the small masters and the concentration of capital. Footnote quoting the Report of Inspector of Factories, 31st October, 1865, but it must be borne in mind that those improvements, though carried out fully in some establishments, are by no means general, and are not capable of being brought into use in many of the old manufactories without an expenditure of capital beyond the means of many of the present occupiers. I cannot but rejoice, writes Sub-Inspector May, that notwithstanding the temporary disorganization which inevitably follows the introduction of such a measure as the Factory Act Extension Act, and is indeed directly indicative of the evils which it was intended to remedy, etc. Unquote. Back to the main text. Besides the purely technical impediments that are removable by technical means, the irregular habits of the workpeople themselves obstruct the regulation of the hours of labor. This is especially the case where piece wage predominates and where loss of time in one part of the day or week can be made good by subsequent overtime or by night work, a process which brutalizes the adult workman and ruins his wife and children. Footnote, with blast furnaces, for instance, quote, work towards the end of the week being generally much increased in duration in consequence of the habit of the men of idling on Monday and occasionally during a part or the whole of Tuesday also. Unquote. That's from the Children's Employment Commission Report 3. Continuing the quotes, the little masters generally have very irregular hours. They lose 2 or 3 days and then work all night to make it up. They always employ their own children if they have any. The want of regularity in coming to work, encouraged by the possibility and practice of making up for this by working longer hours. In Birmingham, an enormous amount of time is lost, idling part of the time, slaving the rest. Unquote. Back to the main text. Although this absence of regularity in the expenditure of labor power is a natural and rude reaction against the tedium of monotonous drudgery, it originates also to a much greater degree from anarchy in production. Anarchy that, in its turn, presupposes unbridled exploitation of labor power by the capitalist. Besides the general periodic changes of the industrial cycle and the special fluctuations in the markets to which each industry is subject, we may also reckon what is called the season, dependent either on the periodicity of favorable seasons of the year for navigation or on fashion and the sudden placing of large orders that have to be executed in the shortest possible time. The habit of giving such orders becomes more frequent with the extension of railways and telegraphs. Quoting the Children's Employment Commission Report 4, the extension of the railway system throughout the country has tended very much to encourage giving short notice. Purchasers now come up from Glasgow, Manchester, and Edinburgh once every fortnight or so to the wholesale city warehouses which we supply, and give small orders requiring immediate execution, instead of buying from stock as they used to do. Years ago, we were always able to work in the slack time so as to meet demand of the next season, but now, no one can say beforehand what will be the demand then. And then another quote, the extension of the railway system is said to have contributed greatly to this custom of giving sudden orders and the consequent hurry, neglect of meal times, and late hours of the workpeople. Unquote. In those factories and manufactories that are not yet subject to the Factory Acts, the most fearful overwork prevails periodically during what is called the season, in consequence of sudden orders. In the outside department of the factory, of the manufactory, and of the warehouse, the so-called domestic workers, whose employment is at the best irregular, are entirely dependent for their raw material and their orders on the caprice of the capitalist, who, in this industry, is not hampered by any regard for depreciation of his buildings and machinery, and risks nothing by a stoppage of work, but the skin of the worker themselves. Here he then sets himself systematically to work to form an industrial reserve force that shall be ready at a moment's notice. During one part of the year he decimates this force by the most inhuman toil, during the other part he lets it starve for want of work. Quoting the Children's Employment Commission Report 4, the employers avail themselves of the habitual irregularity in the homework, when any extra work is wanted at a push, so that the work goes on till 11 and 12 p.m. or 2 a.m., or as the usual phrase is, all hours. And that in localities where, quote, the stench is enough to knock you down, you go to the door perhaps and open it, but shudder to go further. They are curious men, said one of the witnesses, a shoemaker. Speaking of the masters, they think it does a boy no harm to work too hard for half the year if he is nearly idle for the other half. End of quoted section. In the same way as technical impediments, so too those, quote, usages which have grown with the growth of trade were and still proclaimed by interested capitalists as obstacles due to the nature of the work. This was a favorite cry of the cotton lords at the time they were first threatened with the Factory Acts. Although their industry more than any other depends on navigation, yet experience has given them the lie. Since then, every pretended obstruction to business has been treated by the factory inspectors as a mere sham. Footnote quoting the report of Inspector of Factories, 31st October 1862, with respect to the loss of trade by non-completion of shipping orders in time, I remember that this was the pet argument of the factory masters in 1832 and 1833. Nothing that can be advanced now on this subject could have the force that it had then, before steam had halved all distances and established new regulations for transit. It quite failed at that time of proof when put to the test, and again it will certainly fail should it have to be tried." Unquote. Back to the main text. The thoroughly conscientious investigations of the Children's Employment Commission prove that the effect of the regulation of the hours of work, in some industries, was to spread the mass of labor previously employed more evenly over the whole year, that this regulation was the first rational bridle on the murderous, meaningless caprices of fashion, caprices that consort so badly with the system of modern industry. Footnote, John Bellers remarked as far back as 1699, quote, "The uncertainty of fashions does increase necessitous poor. It has two great mischiefs in it. First, the journeymen are miserable in winter for want of work, the mercers and master weavers not daring to lay out their stocks, to keep the journeymen employed before the spring comes, and they know what the fashion will then be. Secondly, in the spring the journeymen are not sufficient, but the master weavers must draw in many prentices, that they may supply the trade of the kingdom in a quarter or half a year, which robs the plough of hands, drains the country of laborers, and in a great part stocks the city with beggars, and starves some in winter that are ashamed to beg." That's quoting from Essays about the Poor, Manufactures, etc. Back to the main text. That the development of ocean navigation and of the means of communication generally has swept away the technical basis on which season work was really supported, and that all the other so-called unconquerable difficulties vanish before larger buildings, additional machinery, increase in the number of work people employed, and the alterations caused by all these in the mode of conducting the wholesale trade. Couple of footnotes there, first one quoting the Children's Employment Commission, fifth report. The evidence of some Bradford export houses is as follows, quote, "Under these circumstances, it seems clear that no boys need be worked longer than from 8 a.m. to 7 or 7:30 p.m. in making up. It is merely a question of extra hands and extra outlay. If some masters were not so greedy, the boys would not work late. An extra machine only costs 16 or 18 pounds. Much of such overtime as does occur is to be referred to an insufficiency of appliances and a want of space." Quoting it again, a London manufacturer who, in other respects, looks upon the compulsory regulation of the hours of labor as a protection for the work people against the manufacturers and for the manufacturers themselves against the wholesale trade, states, quote, "The pressure in our business is caused by the shippers, who want, for example, to send the goods by sailing vessel so as to reach their destination at a given season, and at the same time want to pocket the difference in freight between a sailing vessel and a steamship, or who select the earlier of two steamships in order to be in the foreign market before their competitors." Unquote. Back to the main text. But for all that, capital never becomes reconciled to such changes, and this is admitted over and over again by its own representatives, except, quote, "under the pressure of a general act of Parliament." Footnote, again quoting the fifth report, "This could be obviated, says a manufacturer, at the expense of an enlargement of the works under the pressure of a general act of Parliament." Back to the main text, for the compulsory regulation of the hours of labor.